Imagine this. On a winter night in 1457 AD, the sound of a girl's scream echoes through the stone hallways of Bleo Castle. Like a razor through silk, the sound pierces the howling wind. Lady Margaret Beaufort, 13, clutches the bloody blankets under her in a room with just flickering candles for light, her tiny body trembling with an agony no child should ever experience. The midwives, their faces solemn in the whirling shadows, murmur prayers in Latin. Outside, snow falls on Bedfordshire's frozen landscape. However, a girl who is barely out of childhood is being ripped away from a future king of England within this room. Margaret's auburn hair clings to her sweat-drenched face as another wave of agony crashes over her. She is dying, they think. The baby is too large, her hips too narrow. At 13, her body is not finished growing. Yet here she labors to bring forth the son who will one day sit upon the throne of England as Henry. The irony is lost on no one present. This child, born of such suffering, will end the bloodiest conflict in English history and found the Tudor dynasty that will reshape the world. The girl writhing in that bed was no ordinary noble maiden. Lady Margaret Beaufort carried within her veins the blood of kings, specifically the blood of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, fourth son of Edward, but royal blood could be both blessing and curse. In 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses would soon tear the realm apart, such bloodlines made you either a valuable pawn or a dangerous threat. Margaret's path to that birthing chamber began when she was still a child. Born around May 1443 to John Beaumont, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she entered a world where marriage was the ultimate weapon of statecraft. Her father died when she was barely a year old, some say by his own hand, after military defeats in France. By age 6, she was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk, but when Suffolk fell from grace and was murdered in 1450, that betrothal became worthless. Her next betrothal came swiftly to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts with questionable legitimacy, but they had the king's favor. In 1455, when Margaret was approximately 12, she was married to Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that sealed political alliances with vows she barely understood. The marriage was consummated immediately. There was no concept of waiting for physical maturity when noble girls were treated as broodmares for dynastic ambitions. Within months of her wedding, Margaret's body began changing in ways that terrified her young mind. But Edmund Tudor would never see his child born. In autumn 1456, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured and died in prison. Whether from plague or murder remains unclear. By November 1456, 13-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world exploding into civil war. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, took responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law, bringing her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales. The massive stone fortress offered protection from the growing chaos outside. Here, perched on cliffs above Milford Haven, Margaret would endure the most harrowing experience of her young life. The castle's physician examined her with growing alarm. Her hips were too narrow, the child positioned badly. Birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. Dr. Lewis Caerleon was a man of learning who had studied at Oxford and Paris, but as he examined the pregnant child in his care, all his knowledge seemed inadequate. He confided his fears to Jasper Tudor. Margaret's pelvis had not fully developed, and the baby showed signs of distress. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed through the dark winter months, she displayed maturity beyond her years. She spent time learning about politics and statecraft, understanding that knowledge would be her greatest weapon. Jasper Tudor became her tutor in survival, teaching her to read people's faces and understand the complex web of alliances governing noble society. She also threw herself into religious study with intensity that worried her attendants, spending hours in prayer until her knees bled. On that January night in 1457, Margaret's labor began while she walked the castle battlements. When the first contraction struck, pain unlike anything she had experienced doubled her over. The midwives exchanged meaningful glances. They had seen this before, a child trying to give birth to a child, nature pushed beyond its limits. For 18 hours, Margaret labored in agony that defied description. Her screams echoed off stone walls until her voice gave out, leaving only gasping sounds of suffering. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood as they tried to save both mother and child. As dawn approached, Margaret's strength began to fail. The decision was made to attempt manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might save the child at the cost of the mother's life. When the baby finally emerged, torn from Margaret's body in a process that nearly killed her, the chamber held its breath. The infant was pale, barely breathing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. Then Dame Gwenlliant cleared the baby's mouth, and a thin, angry wail filled the air, the sound that announced the arrival of Henry Tudor, future King of England. The damage to Margaret's body was severe and permanent. Dr. Kellyan found extensive tearing and internal injuries that would never fully heal. She would never bear another child. At 13, she was effectively barren, her reproductive life sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. The physical recovery was agonizingly slow, and her psychological trauma manifested in nightmares and an intense fear of physical contact. But if Margaret's body was broken, her spirit remained unshattered. She understood that her son represented the future of the Lancastrian cause and that a landless widow with a baby needed protection in a world sliding toward chaos. Her solution was marriage again. In 1458, barely recovered from Henry's birth, she married Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham, a practical arrangement that provided safety for herself and her son. Through the bloody conflicts that followed, Margaret learned to navigate treacherous political waters with increasing skill. She cultivated relationships with women from both sides of the Wars of the Roses, understanding that female networks often proved more durable than male alliances. Throughout these turbulent years, her son Henry remained in Wales under Jasper Tudor's guardianship, a heartbreaking but necessary arrangement that kept him safe, but meant Margaret saw her only child perhaps once or twice a year. In 1471, everything changed. The Battle of Tewkesbury saw the final defeat of the Lancastrian cause and the death of Edward, Prince of Wales. Suddenly, Margaret's teenage son became the most viable claimant to the Lancastrian succession, and therefore one of the most dangerous people in England. Recognizing the immediate threat, Jasper Tudor made a desperate decision. He would take the boy into exile rather than risk capture and execution. On a storm-lashed night in September 1471, 14-year-old Henry Tudor boarded a ship at Tenby and sailed into 14 years of exile in Brittany. Margaret was not present for her son's departure and only learned of it days later. The shock was overwhelming. After 14 years separated by Wales, now they were separated by the English Channel and the hostility of nations. Margaret returned to England with a heart that had calcified into something harder than steel. The grief of separation transformed into cold, calculating ambition. She began building networks of support throughout England, identifying nobles who might support her son's eventual return. When Henry Stafford died in 1471, she chose power over safety for her third marriage, wedding Thomas Stanley, one of the most politically adept nobles in England. Stanley was a master of backing the winning side at the last possible moment. His family controlled significant military forces, and his political connections reached every level of society. For Margaret, alliance with Stanley meant access to intelligence networks and military resources that might prove crucial to her son's cause. Together, they survived the dangerous final years of Edward's reign. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in 1483, his 12-year-old son Edward V inherited the throne, but the boy king would never be crowned. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a coup, and young Edward V and his brother disappeared into the Tower of London, never to be seen alive again. Richard III's usurpation destroyed Yorkist legitimacy, and suddenly Henry Tudor's distant claim began to look viable. Margaret began to plot with breathtaking audacity, coordinating a rebellion within England while arranging for her son to invade from Brittany. The rebellion collapsed in October 1483 when betrayal exposed Henry's planned invasion, but Margaret was not defeated. Even under house arrest, she continued plotting through coded letters and trusted servants. When Henry finally invaded at Milford Haven in August 1485, Margaret's patient cultivation of the Stanley family paid its ultimate dividend. At Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, Richard III died fighting in the mud as the Stanley forces turned on him in a betrayal Margaret had orchestrated through years of careful manipulation. Her son was King of England. After 28 years of separation, 14 years of exile, and decades of patient planning, Henry VII had triumphed. Margaret became the most powerful woman in England, but she never again enjoyed the simple relationship of mother and child that had been stolen from her by political necessity. She lived to see her son establish the Tudor dynasty and marry Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses. She died in 1509, just days after Henry VII's own death, having completed an arc of ambition that began in the blood-soaked birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle. The cost of Margaret's success cannot be calculated in simple terms. She sacrificed her body to give England a king, her motherhood to political necessity, her personal happiness to dynastic ambition. The 13-year-old girl screaming in labor at Pembroke Castle could never have imagined the woman she would become, the king's mother, the founder of a dynasty, the woman who ended the Wars of the Roses through maternal love transmuted into political gold. In Westminster Abbey, where Margaret Beaumont lies in her tomb of black marble, visitors can read the Latin inscription summarizing a life of extraordinary achievement built upon extraordinary sacrifice. But they cannot hear the echoes of that long-ago scream, the sound of a child in agony bringing forth the future of England. That sound and the story it began remains buried in the stone walls of a Welsh castle, where the Atlantic waves still crash against the cliffs, and the wind still howls through the ancient stones, carrying whispers of a girl who became a queen mother through suffering that no child should ever endure.